The next element in our study of design and composition is focal point. And focal point is one of the most important as it's the dominant point of emphasis in any work or image. It's defined as an element in a work that initially attracts the attention of the viewer and encourages the viewer to take a closer look. Besides the main element in focus, additional points of emphasis in the work that aren't as prominent but still add an important focus to the work are called accents. So accents can be the supporting role to the focal point, or even sometimes called a secondary focal point. When creating a focal point in a work, many devices are used to accompany and help place the emphasis or point. So by using other elements that we studied about so far, like line direction or maybe even value contrast, those can be an effective tool to use to create a focal point or a highlighted area of importance for the viewer to look at that particular subject or point that you've brought them to. The thing that becomes trickier and challenging about this is deciding the importance of each element in your work and the degree as to which you'd like it to be emphasized. So is it going to be a main focal point? Is it going to be an accent to support the focal point? The second is obviously the placement of the elements in the work. Where are these things going to be placed in order to keep the unity and harmony of the entire work, as well as balance? So this first work that we're looking at is Anne-Louise Girardot-Trisson's The Entombment of Atala. And this was done in 1808. Just a little background on this painting. Atala is the girl in the painting, in the middle there. And she's poisoned herself rather than succumb to carnal love, as she's a Christian. So kind of a Romeo and Juliet story of sorts. In this painting in particular, she's being buried. And she is our focal point for this particular painting. She's the point of emphasis. Normally, if we were in class together, I would ask you why that is. But since I'm just recording this, I will tell you that Atala is the highest contrast area of this painting. She is the lightest part. She is also in the middle of the painting, which helps us as viewers. Typically, as viewers viewing any sort of art piece, we tend to look at the middle. We also tend to look at people or faces. And so that helps kind of identify where or what that focal point is. The other thing that makes Atala the focal point in this piece is that she has two individuals that are her accents or her supporting role. The one man is holding her at the top and the other man is holding her feet. And these men act as secondary focal points to frame Atala. Now, I would argue a very strong secondary or accent in the top left of the page here. And that is the cross. And what we notice about this area is that this is the very highest contrast point. There's less of the light here as there is in Atala, but it's also next to the darkest area in the whole painting. And so this would be argued as a secondary focal point. This also helps us, the artist is intentionally helping to move our eye around the painting and to know that this is an important element of whatever the story is here. As we know, one of the most powerful and most successful and popular ways to create emphasis in a work is by using contrast in some form. We learned that in our shape project and our value project. And we will be using this concept much more often as we learn about more elements and principles. Our second work is one by Anish Kapoor, and this was done in 1981. Anish Kapoor is the artist who, if you've been to Chicago, did the bean or cloud gate in Millennium Park. Anyway, this is another one of Anish Kapoor's works, and it has a very descriptive title. It's called As If to Celebrate, I Discovered a Mountain Blooming with Red Flowers. So it gives you insight into what it is we're looking at here. It's a great example of an artist who's creating emphasis using contrast as well. In this piece, there are some sculptural forms that have been covered with a very pure, intense powdered pigment. And not only is contrast an example of how focal point or emphasis is created here, but emphasis by isolation as well. This little yellow portion is physically isolated or distanced from the other portions in this painting. In this sculpture. And by doing so, the artist is telling you that they would like you to look in this area, bringing your attention to that area. The artist also does that by changing the color. Even though these things are very attractive because they're bigger and they're brighter, creating emphasis by isolation is another way. Contrast and isolation is another way to get your viewer to look in a certain area that you're interested in them looking at. So let's look at another example of focal point or emphasis by isolation. Isolation is sometimes called alienation, but describes that emphasis that's achieved by physically separating something. So this work is one by Andrew Wyeth, and it's called Christina's World. It's a watercolor painting, and it was done in 1948. It's a really great example of isolation being emphasized on a two-dimensional surface. So here we have Christina in the middle of, or I guess the lower left hand of the painting. And she's very much, if we were to tell a story about it, maybe physically isolated from anything, but also as just an element, she is a element that is isolated from the rest of her surroundings on the two-dimensional surface as well. Things that we can notice about why Christina is our emphasis or focal point, right? We have this high contrast area right here, darkest part next to the lightest part. I also would argue that her gaze leads us to these other secondary or accent focal points in the distance, which Andrew Wyeth does a great job then of leading his viewer's eye around the painting by the way that he's placed the elements and the contrast and the lighting in the other sense. But a little bit of background on this painting as well, because I always love to talk about the stories involved of why people create. So the artist, Andrew Wyeth and Christina, were friends, and they started out as neighbors and then became friends in Maine, and he admired this woman very much. She was older than him, but he just happened to end up on her doorstep at one time because he wanted to paint her house. He thought it was beautiful, and he describes her as very intelligent. She was unable to walk due to a childhood illness that she was struggling with. But she loved the feeling of being out in the field alone, and Andrew Wyeth really enjoyed having conversations with her. He thought she was very intelligent, and so he would take her out and he would paint her, and they would have these great little conversations, and yeah, nice little background story for that one. All right, next painting. So creatively, this next painting is entitled Painting, which isn't a great descriptor of what we're looking at, although maybe a more literal descriptor. This is Juan Miro's painting, and it was done in 1933. It's also a really great but pretty different example of isolation and focal point that are created by contrast, in the sense that Andrew Wyeth's piece was more realistic or naturalism. This piece we have abstract shapes or maybe even non-representational shapes happening. So what we notice here, what I noticed very first, is this red and white portion of the painting. And that stands out to me because of the really, really high contrast area right here. Also because most everything in this painting that is positive space is black. But we have this one little portion that is white and red or burnt orange or whatever that is. Next, I might argue that these high contrast areas in the top left and the bottom right are accents or secondary focal points as well, which here as well, we're noticing that they do a really great job of leading our eye through the painting. This helps to create a harmony and a balance, as well as adding that little bit of variation that keeps your eye looking just a little bit longer at the piece. That ultimately is our goal as artists, right? We want to engage our viewer. We want them to look at our piece and find something interesting in it and have their own interpretation. But we use devices like elements and principles of design to engage our viewer in a way that is a little more sneaky. So this next one is by William Hunt, and it's called Light of the World. It's a really great example of, it was done in the 1800s. Really great example of emphasis that is created by the placement of elements. So this was done during the medieval art period, or era in art, 1800s. And the subject or focal point is typically placed in the direct middle of the painting. And that was very, very popular during that time. It was believed that you, as a viewer, would look at the middle of the painting first. And so therefore you should place your highest important items or elements in the middle of that painting. But this work also has a few of the other things that we have been talking about. And that is super, super high contrast areas, right? Light of the World. Name of the painting also kind of gives us a hint as to what we should be looking for. But the other secondary, maybe even first primary focal point here, supporting role, is Jesus's face and his head. He's surrounded by what we call a nimbus, which is kind of like a halo that was something that was put behind important figures that were deities. So in this case, obviously, Jesus. And this also creates a really high contrast area. One of the other reasons, and this is kind of an obvious one, is that Jesus is a person. He has a face. As humans, we are attracted to faces. We want to look at people. And so creating the high contrast, also having a face there in general, leads your eye to this area. Then this one down here, Light of the World, with the high contrast, helps us to move around the painting, see what's going on. But those devices help us look in those particular areas. So placing those elements there in the center with high contrast help to bring our viewer's eye to those particular areas. This is a work by Paul Cézanne. It's called The Card Players, and this was done in the 1890s. And this also is a great example of everything we've discussed thus far. High contrast, right? Something placed in the middle or the center that is very, very high contrast. So the cards and the bottle, that really dark bottle placed against or placed next to the really bright cards. What's interesting about this one is that we have some very equally as interesting secondary focal points, right? Or accents. Somebody's face here that is light against a dark background. somebody's face here also that is light against a dark background. Another interesting part about this, similarly to the entombment of Atala, is that these men are creating a little bit of a frame for our initial focal point here, our primary focal point. Last but not least, this is a really interesting type of, or method, I guess, of creating a work, and that is the absence of a focal point. So not having any focal point at all. This is Gary Hume's water painting done in 1999. And it's very similar to pattern. So what might be the point of not having any sort of focal point? What might the artist be trying to emphasize or communicate by not having any sort of emphasis, right? Because so far we've talked about how the focal point is the most important part because that's where you're bringing your viewer's eye. Some reasons that an artist might choose to not create a focal point is to give some sense of mystery, maybe. Maybe the artist would like you to look at the painting so long that you're looking for a focal point, but never find one. Maybe also that artist is working particularly with an interesting surface or texture or material, and that is something that they're trying to emphasize. So not maybe one particular area, but the entirety of the thing that is created by whatever it is. And those things are the reasons. So all in all, we should probably create a focal point unless we're trying to be emphasizing something else completely, right? So if we have imagery that we want people to look at, then we create focal point. If we don't, then we don't. Or maybe our intention is mystery. Anyways, you get the point. Okay. I want to talk about our project and assignment for this particular element. This one is a fun one, but of course I'm biased. I think that they're all really fun. So what I'm going to do is just talk to you a little bit about how to construct these pieces that you're going to be doing based off of this painting here. My example is based off of this painting here. We'll start there. And then I'll show you some past artworks that have worked really well, and then some that haven't worked really well, and I'll explain to you why. So hopefully this will be helpful. So the purpose of this assignment obviously is to solidify our understanding of the concept of focal point and emphasis, and to understand how to create that in a visual way ourselves. So I'd like you to choose a painting from either the Renaissance or Baroque art periods. Hint, hint, some people that are frequently used are Peter Paul Rubens. He is a fantastic one to look up, lots of lights and darks. Anyway, so then what you're going to do is simplify the shapes that you're seeing, the main shapes. So in our shape lecture, we talked about biomorphic shapes and what Cronk calls the blob shapes. That's what I want you to do with this any particular Baroque image. So I would, in my sketchbook, make her shape kind of how I might think that her shape is. And I want to be really general because my goal is not to make this look like the painting, but to, again, have a jumping off point for my own artwork that I'm going to make. So back to it. I am going to create a blob shape out of her. And then I'm like, well, obviously, this person as well is a main focal point in this image. And I really like how they're interacting here. So what I'm going to do is with my next shape, I'm going to trace around and make this shape kind of overlapping this other shape. And then I always have to have, personally, 3 elements in a work. I never like to have an even number. So I think what I'm going to do is in this painting, I'm going to look for an accent. and my eye is drawn over here to this scary looking eagle bird. And so for my piece, then I'm going to create a shape out of this. So now that I have kind of a baseline of my 3 shapes that I want to use, I'm going to figure out where I'm going to draw my viewer's eye. And by doing that, I think that I already have one, in that this area that I decided to overlap my shapes I think is really interesting. So you're going to create 2 pieces of work. They can be either square or rectangle. The size is 8 by 10, 8 by 8, depending on how big or small, rectangle or square you'd like to make it. And then I'm going to render one of my composition in black, white, and gray tones using acrylic. And then I'm going to render another one of the same composition using color, whatever medium color you have access to. And the reason that we're going to create 2 of these works is we're going to look at the difference that color makes and how color can be used differently to create focal point or emphasis. So let me show you some student examples of the works. So keep in mind that everybody that did this previously chose a painting from either the Renaissance or Baroque. Peter Paul Rubens is a good one. I'm forgetting the other one. It'll come to me. Okay, so here is a work created by a student based off of either a Renaissance or Baroque painting. Remember that I always give you these prompts as jumping off points to create your own artwork, your own successful composition. Okay, so here, this person simplified some of the shapes that they saw in the painting, and they decided that they wanted to make this area right here their focal point. And so they did that by changing the value within this one particular area. So everything, yes, has different colors, but this also has a starkly brighter value. And so their intention was to draw their viewer here. These accent shapes also help do that, in that this one frames it as well, this one points to it. So I would definitely say that these are secondary focal point or accent shapes to help bring your eye into this area. So here's the second piece. And again, we could see that this area was chosen as well to be that focal point, but it looks almost like a different piece because it was done in gray tones, and looking at how that same composition is changed just by using either color or gray tones. Let's look at another one. Here the artist chose to make one overall really big kind of simplified shape, but to vary the color and value within this particular piece. So here we have the biomorphic blobular shape. My eye tends to look in this area because of the high contrast that's going on. As well as this accent shape here is really interesting to me, and the negative space here. This leads my eye here. I would say that this is a successful composition because of that. The artist has chosen to lead me in this direction. I might maybe have done this a little bit lighter to really kind of push that a little bit farther. Let's look at the gray tones piece. So here's similar method using this area with high contrast. They chose a dark background, and then the positive shape had a light background to help bring your eye there. This piece is a little bit more representational than I would like you to go. I'd like you to try and get a little more blobular than this, but still a really good example of focal point and emphasis by use of shape and color. So I think that these areas obviously are really interesting, but also the artist is leading us down to this high contrast area where they have a little bit of an overlapping and have created a different color using there as well. I think this one, that is a little bit more successful in the sense that we have this really, really light area next to this really, really dark area. We'll look at a few more here. I think this one's one of my favorites. Even though I might argue that there are multiple focal points and that maybe one doesn't necessarily stand out as much, I think it's still a successful piece. I think I might have changed, swapped the green and the yellow here because I think this area and this area would have stood out more if it was green and then yellow instead. But really interesting interpretation of using shapes and overlapping and color to create focal point and emphasis. And here we'll look at the black and white one. Gray tones, excuse me. So again, this one's done in acrylic. This one also was done in acrylic. This one was done in chalk pastel. This one, your black and white gray tones piece should be done in acrylic. This one was done in colored pencil. This one was done in oil or chalk pastel. I think it was chalk pastel actually. And then last but not least, I want to look at these two as an example. I think this design is amazing. This negative space area and then the little white areas really, really grab my attention. And I feel like that this is a very, very successful creation of focal point and emphasis in this particular area. But I also want to bring your attention to this piece. This piece is not successful as a color piece because it has black and white in it. For your color piece, I want you to use color. Black and white are tones and not color. Okay, so if this is going to be red, maybe these should be yellow, maybe these should be purple, and your background, something of the like. I also like to share this piece because this is an interpretation that is too literal. It's too representational. We can see that there are two people here, and then what looks to be an angel. The focal point is created brilliantly and successfully, but it looks too much like the original painting. And so when you're choosing your painting and when you are making your abstract representational kind of shapes, I want you to go more in this direction. Okay, so again, we have the black, white, and gray tones. It's going to be in acrylic paint. That should be done on the canvas pad. And then your color piece should be done in any sort of medium that you have access to that is all color. And sizes are a square or a rectangle, 8 by 10 or 8 by 8. Biomorphic shapes, create focal point or emphasis. Do many sketches in your sketchbook first. And if you would like to run some of them by me, that would be a great idea. Both obviously have the same composition, both of these pieces. You're just doing one in color and one in gray tones. This is going to be due October 16, which is next Friday, and should be submitted via Canvas in 2 separate pictures. So again, please, if you have any questions, reach out. I hope these examples were helpful, and I will try and post some of these as well. I hope you guys have a great weekend.